Have you ever waited for someone to notice that you're hurting only for them to never come back? Have you ever believed that if you were sincere enough, patient enough, hurt enough, someone would stay to understand? But then you realized no one stays up at night for your loneliness, and no one truly cares whether you rise or fall. And that realization, it wasn't a collapse, it was a doorway. This world is not cruel. It's just too busy to care about a quiet soul. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you'll be free. Free from the illusion that others will always understand. Free from the need to explain, to prove, or to beg for recognition. Free from the fragile self that always longs to be loved the right way. That is the beginning of a new strength, a strength that stands firm even when unseen. In this video, we won't learn how to make others care. We'll learn how to stand tall when no one does. Stoicism doesn't teach you to seek sympathy. It teaches you to build an inner force so solid that even when no one understands, you remain unshaken. No one is coming, and that sets you free. There's a truth no one tells you when you're young, that no one is coming to fix the pain you're carrying. No hero appears in the night. No knowing eyes are watching your every moment. No one is truly staying up just thinking about your wounds. And when that truth first touches your awareness, it doesn't arrive with thunder or dramatic collapse. It arrives on a very quiet afternoon, when you realize the phone won't ring, the message won't be sent, and no one is out there looking for you in this world. That very moment, silent and uneventful, is the turning point. Because for the first time, you stop clinging to the illusion that your existence will naturally matter to someone. When you stop waiting for others to show up at the right time, you don't become bitter. You become clear-eyed, not because you no longer need anyone, but because you stop placing your life in the hands of someone who may never understand you. You begin to look at yourself not with contempt and no longer desperately seek someone else's gaze. You begin to have a dialogue, to acknowledge, to show up in your own life as a companion who doesn't run. From that moment on, you stop performing. You no longer need to play the role of the strong one or the broken one. You just need to be yourself, someone who can stand back up, not because someone lifts you, but precisely because no one does. That is the foundation of freedom. Not isolation, not detachment, but a deep awakening to the fact that you are the only one who can take responsibility for your journey. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you escape the game of expectations. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, don't waste the rest of your time here worrying about other people. Not because he despised the world, but because he understood. Mental energy is limited, and you cannot spend it hoping others will show up when you need them. The only presence you truly need's your own. In a world full of noise and half-hearted promises, the silence of reality is a ruthless but liberating gift. It strips away the illusion that you are someone's center of the universe. It makes you see, if you don't take that next step yourself, no one's coming to pull you out of the hole. And within that awareness, you begin to transform. You stop waiting for others to notice your sadness, only to be disappointed. You stop hoping for signs from the outside and start remembering the light inside. No one is coming. but you don't need them anymore. When you stop and look directly into that truth without running, without flinching, that's when real freedom begins to rise. No longer the kind of freedom granted by others, not a freedom handed down by kindness, but a silent, deep, incorruptible kind of freedom that can't be bought or stolen. It is the freedom of a mind that has let go of illusion and begun to mature. 2. Being unseen doesn't mean you're worthless. But there's a quieter kind of pain than loneliness. It's the feeling of being overlooked. You're not expecting someone to come save you, but you still hope someone sees how hard you're trying. You don't need applause, but you can't help feeling hollow when your presence is ignored, as if you're slowly disappearing from the world and no one even notices. It's no longer the illusion of salvation, but the basic human yearning to be acknowledged. And that creates an internal paradox. The more silent you are, the more others forget you exist. But no one teaches you this. That silence, when understood rightly, doesn't make you disappear, but deepens you beyond shallow recognition. The greatest danger of being ignored isn't the external wound, it's that you start to believe you're not valuable. When others don't respond, don't ask, don't notice, you quietly arrive at a false conclusion. Maybe I'm not enough. And from that very thought, you begin to shrink. You speak less, you dream smaller, you please more. You stop living with intention and start living in reaction. Reaction to absence, reaction to indifference, reaction to an emptiness that was never yours to fill. But the truth is, being unseen doesn't mean you're worthless. A seed buried in darkness still carries the potential of a forest. A soul unnoticed can still quietly grow as long as it remembers to see itself. The Stoic does not live to be recognized. They live to be free from the need for recognition. They don't deny the sting of being forgotten, but they don't let it rob them of their right to grow. Seneca once said, "No one can look down on you unless you first look down on yourself." And that applies not only to contempt, but to neglect. When you understand that your worth doesn't come from outside eyes, you stop living as a reflection and start living as a presence. Other people's indifference doesn't reflect a lack in you. It only reflects how deeply they are consumed by their own chaos. Everyone is struggling with an internal storm you cannot see, just as they cannot see yours. When you stop using their detachment as a measure of your worth, that's when you begin to live freely. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to be solid enough to stand in silence and still hold on to yourself. 3. Don't live as if someone is watching. Accepting that others don't see you is not the end. It's the beginning of a life no longer controlled by external eyes. But to go further, you need a radical transformation, not just to stop waiting to be seen, but to stop living as if someone is always watching. Because true freedom isn't found in whether others ignore or pay attention to you. It's found in no longer playing the lead role in a performance where the audience has left. The problem is, even when no one is watching, you keep acting. Even when no one is listening, you choose your words carefully. Even when no one is judging, you still censor yourself. And you're no longer living as a free person, you're living as a display piece, arranged to be palatable, understandable, acceptable. That's not living, that's performing. There's a subtle emptiness that appears when you live to be measured, to fit in, to stay in rhythm with the world. You don't ask what you need, you only ask, what do others think of this? You don't do what you believe in, you do what's easiest for others to digest. Gradually, your individuality is eroded. Freedom is replaced by strategy. Every action is backed by an unspoken script to ensure you won't be misunderstood, judged, or excluded. But that's a life of constant anxiety because you're no longer yourself. You're a version of yourself that you think others will like. And the scariest part, you may start to believe that version is real. Stoic philosophy doesn't teach you to live carelessly. It teaches you to live with weight, a weight that comes from within, not from external validation. Epictetus once said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." And you can't embody anything if you're always afraid someone is scoring your every breath. Live as if no one is watching, because the truth is, most of the time, no one actually is. Every gaze you feel is a projection from an old wound where you were once judged, once abandoned, once condemned. But the present is not the past, and if you don't realize that, you'll stay trapped in a play with no audience. Stopping the performance is the only way to truly live. Not to shock, not to rebel, but to look in the mirror and recognize yourself. A person who no longer needs to be reasonable in others' eyes, only honest in their own. When you live as if no one is watching, what you create is no longer a plea for permission, but a trace of self-mastery. And that self-mastery is the only foundation strong enough to endure rejection, misunderstanding, and silence from the world. 4. Stop performing your pain. Start resolving it. No need to be watched. No need to be understood. No need to perform. Yet another reflex starts to rise, more subtle, more deceptive, and more dangerous. The reflex to turn pain into a story. A part of you is still performing not to be loved, but to be pitied. Not for the audience, but for the fear that if no one sees your pain, it will be forgotten. And in that moment, you're no longer healing, you're building a new stage where pain continues under the soft spotlight of sympathy. There's a quiet habit modern society has nurtured. The habit of sharing pain as an identity. The more it hurts, the more it's real. The more broken, the more heard. But if you pay close attention, you'll see there's a thin line between sincere expression and emotional display crafted to secure a place in others' hearts. Once you start portraying your pain as the only way to connect, you unknowingly imprison yourself in that role. You no longer ask, "How do I move forward?" but only think, "How do I make them see I'm hurting?" And that's when healing gets delayed, not because you can't recover, but because you've become used to stretching the wound just to avoid being forgotten. Stoic philosophy doesn't reject emotion. On the contrary, it treats emotion like fire, not to burn yourself, nor to attract attention, but to illuminate the inner world. A Stoic is not cold. They simply don't hand over control to emotional storms. They hurt, but don't scream. They grieve, but don't need to explain. Because to them, strength isn't in recounting how many times they were wounded, it's in continuing without using their wounds as signals, demanding others step aside. Marcus Aurelius wrote, Be like the cliff against which the waves continually break, but it stands firm and tames the fury of the water around it. Not standing there to fight loudly, but standing there because within there's no longer a need to shout. Only when you stop sharing your pain as a distress signal do you begin the real journey of healing. A journey without narration, without audience. Only honesty and solitude. And only in that solitude will you know which pain needs to be spoken and which must be laid to rest in silence. Not everything must be retold to be real. Not every pain needs applause to hold meaning. Some wounds can only be resolved when you stop performing them and begin to face them. Not as a victim, but as a survivor, rewriting their own definition. 5. Rejection is light, not darkness. There are wounds that don't need to be told, because not everything must be understood by others in order to be healed. But what makes healing most difficult is not the pain itself, it's the feeling of being rejected while carrying that pain. No one wants to go silent until their voice is swallowed by indifference. No one wants to withdraw until every attempt to speak is met with blank stares or mechanical consolation, and so we assume rejection means being left behind. Rejection means worthlessness. Rejection means failure to connect. But then comes a moment quiet, unexpected, unannounced, when you realize rejection is not the darkness you thought it was. It's light blinding, perhaps, painful even, but revealing. Because only through rejection do you truly know where you don't belong. When every door is open, you easily confuse what you want with what you need. But when a door slams shut without explanation, without a second chance, you're forced to ask, have I been knocking on the wrong door? And sometimes, rejection protects you from a life that's not meant for you. Rejection doesn't strip your value, it strips away the illusion that every place is meant for you. And that's not cruelty, it's clarity. The most subtle rejection doesn't come in the form of a no, but through prolonged silence, through the feeling of being present and invisible. But instead of shrinking, it should make you transparent. Transparent enough to see yourself clearly. Transparent enough to no longer be wrapped in others' expectations. When you no longer seek validation through someone else's gaze, rejection loses its power. It no longer defines you, it becomes a mirror, revealing that you've invested too much energy in places that never deserved it. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Rejection is that obstacle, the thing that, once you're brave enough to pass through it, shows you another path you missed simply because you kept looking toward a place that never welcomed you. The pain of not being chosen is not the end. It's a redirection born of awareness. No one can truly know what you need if even you haven't yet faced the loneliness of not being embraced. And it's precisely when no one opens their doors that you learn how to build walls, not to keep others out, but to create a space where you belong without needing an invitation. The first rejection might break you, but by the second, it becomes filtration. By the third, it becomes guidance. And by the fourth, it no longer hurts you. Simply nod, turn away quietly, and know for certain you've wasted no more time in a place that never truly saw you. 6. Step away from the noise to recenter yourself. Not every place that rejects you is worth staying in, just as not every noise is worth hearing. Some rejections come like a jolt, pulling you out of shallow loops of connection, but there are also noises wrapped in false kindness, the kind that leaves you confused, drained, lost in a crowd without knowing what you're exhausting yourself to sustain. And if you're not alert, you'll forget the most important truth. No one is responsible for protecting your inner silence but you. We live in an era where noise is celebrated, where every voice demands a response, every status needs views, and every action begs for explanation. But within that pace, one question fades. Can you still hear yourself? Before others fall silent, you've already spoken again. Before emotion has time to settle, you've already reacted. And then you begin to equate activity with presence, connection with constant display. But what you truly lose is a mind that never had time to pause long enough to ask what it needs and where it's headed. Withdrawing from the noise is not a sign of weakness or avoidance. It's the boldest act of reclaiming your center. The center, not surface silence, but a depth of stillness that lets you hear your inner voice, undistorted by the world's frequency. When you leave hollow conversations, when you step away from arguments that never needed winners, you begin to see how much of your energy was scattered into things so trivial. And only then can you gather those fragments of yourself to start living from a true point of origin. Carl Jung once wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." Every profound awakening begins not with applause, but with the absence of noise. When you dare to sit alone in a room with no praise, no validation, no interaction, only then do you see clearly what is real, what is false, what is yours, and what has been parasitic. That first moment will often feel terrifying, but if you stay through it, it becomes the most fertile ground to rebuild something solid from within. No one teaches you how to retreat without feeling small. No one shows you how to stay silent without disappearing. But the Stoics lived this truth thousands of years ago. They didn't need to be seen to feel whole, didn't need to be heard to know they existed. They understood that the center isn't something to prove, it's something to preserve. Preserve it by stepping back from the swirl that constantly pulls you into other people's lives until you no longer know where you stand in your own. 7. Loneliness has a purpose. When you've become still enough to clearly hear yourself, the next thing you'll encounter is not peace but loneliness. Not loud, not violent, but deep and real. It arrives as an inevitable consequence after you step away from noise, from social spirals, from conversations that kept you busy but empty. And if you don't understand its nature, you'll think you're lost. But the truth is, you've just stepped into a different space where loneliness is no longer a punishment, but a doorway to quiet inner transformation. Modern humans carry an ingrained fear of loneliness, as if it signals that we're on the wrong path, being left behind, or unworthy of having someone by our side. But to a Stoic, loneliness is a necessary, almost sacred state. Not to inflict suffering on oneself, but to peel away the false layers life has placed upon you. Only in that solitude can you see clearly who you've been trying to become, who you've been hiding, and who you truly are without performance. without craving affection, without seeking validation. Loneliness has a purpose. It doesn't come to shrink you, but to clarify you. It teaches you that no one is coming to save you, and that's not as terrible as you think, because only then do you begin to enter the true power of a person with inner freedom. You no longer wait for someone to understand, to rescue, or to fill the void. Because that very void becomes the space where you lay a new foundation for yourself. A foundation that needs no approval, a path that needs no cheerleaders, an inner voice that needs no agreement. Epictetus once said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." And you'll never do that if you constantly live within the presence of others. Part of becoming is being willing to walk through barren lands where no one listens, no one validates, no one waits for your words. There, every unanswered question bounces back to you like a mirror. And each time you don't collapse from being unheard, you prove that you've overcome the most subtle trap: living to be understood. You don't need to force yourself to get used to loneliness. You just need to shift your perspective. Instead of seeing it as a lack, see it as a milestone. No one crosses the threshold of real maturity without having been lonely. No one builds a strong soul without having lived with silence. And no one retains deep self-respect if they always need someone else to remind them of their worth. 8. Maturity doesn't need recognition. When you no longer run from loneliness but choose to remain with it, you begin to mature in a way that no one sees, no one praises, and no one can touch. True maturity makes no sound. It comes with no celebration, no certificates, no one calling your name in a crowd. It's like quietly getting up one morning, not because someone pushed you, not because of expectant eyes, but because you know it's time to move forward. And you do it silently, steadily, and without needing applause. Maturity doesn't need recognition because it no longer depends on outside approval. You don't need someone's agreement to act rightly. You don't need someone's support to maintain your boundaries. And you don't need anyone watching to stay committed to yourself. Maturity isn't measured by how many listen to you, but by how many principles you continue to uphold, even when no one knows you're holding them. The modern world confuses volume with growth. People believe that if you've changed, you must announce it. That if you've healed, you must tell someone. But the truth is, what needs proving is still incomplete. When you've truly matured, you no longer feel the need to show it. You don't need to recount what you endured. You don't need to explain why you're quiet. You don't need to justify your choices, because you're no longer living to be understood. You're living to be aligned. The deepest form of maturity comes the moment you stop waiting for others to respond and begin acting simply because it must be done. You no longer seek validation from family, friends, or anyone else. You validate yourself by living in alignment with the values you've chosen. And the paradox is this: when you no longer need recognition, you begin to earn respect. Not because you demand it, but because the energy you emit makes it impossible for others to dismiss you again. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself, "Don't waste the rest of your time here worrying about other people." Because maturity doesn't require you to wonder whether others will understand, agree with, or praise you. It only requires that you uphold moral clarity even when no one cares why you're doing it. And it's precisely in the absence of a spotlight that you become the clearest, strongest, most unshakable version of yourself. Maturity, in the end, is not something you share. It is something you express through every quiet decision, every boundary you protect, every temptation you refuse, every time you remind yourself, I don't live to be admired. I live to avoid being ashamed of myself. And that will always be enough. 9. Become someone who is no longer easily read. When you no longer need recognition, you begin to act from a deeper center, one that no one can reach or predict. Because most predictable behaviors are rooted in the desire to be liked, to be agreed with, to feel safe within familiar patterns. But when you stop living to please, stop making decisions to keep someone's warmth, and stop bending yourself to avoid judgment, you become confusing to those who once thought they knew you well. And that very confusion is the mark of a silent rebirth, the rebirth of someone no longer easily controlled. You no longer react the way you used to, no longer respond according to familiar scripts. You refuse to participate in conversations that drain your energy just to maintain surface harmony. You don't answer repetitive questions just to soothe someone's anxiety. You don't explain your plans in detail, and you don't rush to clarify your silence. Every decision you make now is filtered through self-awareness, not expectation. And that's why you quietly step out of the path of being predictable, not because you're trying to appear mysterious, but because you're finally living honestly. Becoming unpredictable is not a tactic. It's a natural result of stepping out of your old operating system where every action mirrored someone else's gaze. In that world, your anger was a reaction to disrespect, your sadness was a silent plea, and your silence was a passive weapon. But when you begin to detach from reflexes and act from conscious intent, you can no longer be read because no one holds the levers to your emotions anymore. Your calmness disorients people. They can no longer pull you into the old game, can't lead you through the script they were used to. When you're no longer easily angered, easily agreeable, easily softened, they're forced to face the futility of their tactics. And it's precisely when you stop reacting as expected that they must confront how they've been living. You don't do this to manipulate, but because you refuse to be manipulated anymore. Unpredictability in someone who was once easy to read doesn't come from changing their tone or behavior. It comes from a shift in motive. Before, you acted to preserve connection. Now, you act to preserve integrity. Before, you spoke to be soothed. Now, you choose silence to protect inner order. And because no one can regulate your internal rhythm anymore, they lose the ability to affect you like they once did. Becoming someone who is no longer easy to read is the first step toward becoming someone who is no longer easy to control. It doesn't isolate you, it liberates you, because true freedom doesn't come from doing whatever you want, but from no longer being dragged around by what others want. When you're no longer predictable, you begin to live by your own rhythm, quiet, steady, and impossible to replicate. 10. Rebirth in silence and living with clear presence. Once people can no longer read you, you begin to sense a kind of silent power you've never touched before. That power doesn't come from display and doesn't need recognition. It rises from the quiet transformation within a rebirth that no one witnesses. No declarations, no spotlight. A rebirth that happens in silence, but strong enough to change the entire direction of a life. That silence is not emptiness. It is a foundation. In silence, you begin to observe yourself like an outsider, no rush to fix, no urge to condemn, just watching until the old layers naturally fall away. You're no longer in a hurry to become someone, no longer chasing any standard, no longer trying to control what was never yours. And it's in that letting go that a new self begins to form, no longer bound by old roles, no longer boxed in by old expectations. You don't talk about the change. You don't post about it online. You don't tell anyone. But it seeps into every action, every decision, every nod, and every retreat. You no longer need anyone to name it growth, because you no longer need confirmation. Instead, you choose to live with clear presence, knowing where you are, why you're there, and being ready to leave when it no longer fits. That's not coldness, that's clarity. Presence doesn't mean speaking up. Sometimes, silence is the clearest sign that you've awakened. When you can walk into a room without needing to fill it with stories, laughter, or artificial comfort, you are present. When you can say no without offering explanations, you are present. When you can walk away without guilt, without writing a justification, you are present. Not because you're cold, but because you've matured enough to know that true presence doesn't lie in others seeing you, but in you no longer losing yourself. Rebirth in silence is a solitary journey, but it's a chosen solitude where you no longer need applause and begin living as if every step matters, even if no one is watching. You no longer live to be seen, you live to feel fully. Everything you once tried to prove, you now simply express through action. Everything you once feared to lose, you are now willing to release if it no longer reflects your truth. That rebirth is not an event. It's a slow transfusion. You stop performing, stop resisting, stop bracing yourself. You no longer walk to get somewhere, you walk to live authentically. And in that journey, there's no need to announce your transformation. You just continue quietly, but steadily, with a presence that cannot be faked. I once lived as if being kind enough, sincere enough, would make someone finally see me. As if enduring enough pain would make someone come and heal the things I could never say aloud. But no one came. And it was in that very moment, the moment I stopped waiting for a hand to reach from the outside, that something truly solid began. I started to understand. Not being seen doesn't mean being invisible. Not being understood doesn't mean being wrong. And not being chosen doesn't mean being worthless. I no longer needed anyone to define my emotions, nor validate whether my pain was reasonable or not. I learned to sit with it, quietly, patiently, long enough for it to become part of my inner structure, a part that helps me stand firm, no longer a part that makes me tremble. If this journey is calling to you, don't ignore it. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss what's coming next. Because here, we're not chasing attention. We're rebuilding something unshakable from within. I'll see you in the next video.